Today, I'm very excited about this following presentation. This was one of the ones that when we looked at the topics we wanted to cover rose quickly to the top of the list. And it is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce you to Jordan Howard and Jimmy Christianson from AGC of America, who are going to tell you all a little bit more today about winning and performing government contracts. Jimmy, Jordan, come on, take the stage.
I'm Jimmy Christianson, AGC of America's Regulatory Counsel. This is Jordan Howard. He's our Associate Director of our Federal and Heavy Construction Division. Today we're going to talk to you a little bit about what it's like to work for the federal government directly. Agencies like the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, GSA, General Services Administration, Department of Veterans Affairs. We'll also touch a little bit on federal fund transportation work, but mostly focus on federal government contracting. Jordan, kick us off.
So here's a sort of an overview of what we hope to cover. To begin with, we're going to touch on some of the differences between the federal and the private construction market, how the projects are different, some of the rules and regulations. Then we're going to talk a little bit about preparing to enter the federal market. It's a very vast and complex market. It's not something you jump in lightly. There has to be a lot of preparation. And then finally, some of the steps to enter the federal market. There's specific requirements and websites and forms that have to be filled out. Then we're also going to talk about performing these federal projects, some pitfalls to avoid, and finally some issues coming out of Washington, D.C. Infrastructure is a hot topic, and we're going to see a lot more federal spending hopefully in the future. This was the first time in any presidential debate that infrastructure was spoken on by both candidates and President Trump's State of the Union speech as well. So we're talking about what's coming out of the Capitol. So the first big difference of the federal and the private construction market is just the proportion of it. The federal market's actually very small compared to the private industry and state and local. So but within that small percentage is billions of dollars worth of construction work. And here's a little trend, some graphs that track total spending on construction. You can see the peak was in 2006. Then we had our Great Recession that really bottomed out a lot of these the sectors of the construction industry. The little green line at the bottom is public. So what you have seen is that spending has been consistent through the public market. So that's one thing that we note. It's not as tethered to the volatilities of the market. It's rather consistent. And on the graph on the right, we see the employment numbers. The main thing to take away from this is that construction employment still has not totally recovered from the 2006 recession. And this is an AGC summary and forecast of what we think will the growth sector of the construction market. You notice the public sector is highlighted in green. 2005, it was 5%. It dipped in 2016, and our forecast for this year is moderate growth, 0 to 3%. It's moderate, but it's still significant. We're not factoring in any sort of Hail Mary infrastructure package. This is based on what we think is likely to see the trends in the coming year.
And Jordan, I would add the thing that a lot of construction companies have to think about is diversifying your portfolio of construction work. Although the public sector might not be growing that tremendously, we think about what happened in 2008. If you didn't have any public construction work going on, you were hurting pretty hard because there wasn't really anywhere else to go. But the federal and state markets, we had the stimulus money that was pumping through. There were not quite any shovel-ready projects, but there was money going to construction in the federal and transportation markets where many of our private markets were tanking. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of, in the construction industry, we're really subject to the whims of the economy, the booms and the recessions. So keeping in mind that you've got to be prepared for when there's a downturn, it really makes sense in your portfolio to have some sort of government contracting element, if you can, in place.
And so this is just a overview of awards. When the federal government spends money, they do it through a number of ways, either direct federal contracting, grants to states or the loans. and then if you look at the map of the U.S., you can kind of see the concentration of federal spending. So this might be a factor if you're looking to join the federal market, what state you're in, and seeing if there's a lot of activity there, or if it's one of the lighter shades. And this is a survey that AGC conducted with thousands of respondees and participants. It's sort of it's just the feeling of how optimistic the markets are within the various degrees, and you can see at the federal level at the very bottom, 25% think that there's going to be increased spending, 18% think it's going to be lower, 57% thinks it's going to be about the same, and that would be consistent with some of the previous indications as well.
And there's about $100 billion that's direct federal construction spending, and then there's an additional, I'd say about $40 billion a year that the federal government doles out to the state departments of transportation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you look at it, you can see in the various sectors as well, like particularly manufacturing and public buildings, highway, K through 12 especially. We think is going to. The trends are that contractors are expecting more work to come. So if you're in one of those sectors, it's maybe something that you need to consider.
So, what's the difference between doing work for the federal government and a private owner? A whole heck of a lot. There's increased regulatory burdens, different laws. In the private world, you don't have the prevailing wage rules of Davis-Bacon. You don't have as many issues with, let's say, green construction specs or various requirements on the labor side, where, for example, now your employees have to have 7 days of paid sick leave as a federal contractor. There's a federal contractor minimum wage. There are a host of different things that you have to keep in mind on the regulatory side for federal work that you don't have to worry about on the private side. And really knowing those differences are key to whether or not you want to get involved in it or not. So preparing to enter the federal market, working for a government entity is different than working for a private entity. Again, not just because of the regulatory risks, but just incentives. The federal government doesn't necessarily have the same incentives to get a project done as those in the private market do. We find that, generally speaking, there will be project funding that flows through, but you might not get a decision from a government owner as quickly as you do from a private owner, because money isn't as necessarily a driving factor for these government agencies because they constantly have a flow of it. We find that working for government employees can be difficult. Contractors who do this work, the real key is you got to know not just which agency you want to work for, but who's the project manager on the job, who's your contracting officer. It's really key to know the people. Construction is a people business. You could have the best equipment, you could have your case equipment, but if you don't have the right people on the job to use it, the right people giving you decisions, it doesn't matter what's federal or whether it's private, it's not going to be a good job if they're not talking. But generally speaking, we find that the problems on the federal market happen when you deal with the people that are pretty much those long-term government employees that don't really want to pick up the phone because they're on vacation for 2 weeks, but you're on the job and need an answer. So you have to, that's something, you're all risk managers if you're in a construction business, and you have to take that into account when you bid this work. There are plenty of companies that do take this into account, do have very healthy profit margins, a lot of the bigger companies, and then there's also small businesses. So you also have to worry about the federal funding. The government shuts down these days every now and then over some sort of political issue. That could impact your project. Luckily, they have to pay you for the delay, but you don't really make money on lawsuits, generally speaking. You don't want to pay your lawyers the money you should be getting anyway. There's also different ways that they do contracting. There's multiple award contracting orders where they get a pool of contractors and then get different task orders and pick from that pool. Those different pools can have up to 5, it could have up to 20 contractors, and they can last for as long as 5 years. So if you're in an area where you're on one of these projects and you get a contract that's a multiple award contract, like an indefinite quantity contract, it's great if you got it because you know you're probably going to get work somewhere in that 5 years. If you're not on them, you're not going to really get work in that area because everyone's either on that contract or are not. So contracting vehicles matter, and making sure you can get in makes a difference. Past performance. The most difficult thing about getting into the federal market is federal owners really want to make sure that you have federal work experience. How do you get into the market if you don't have any work experience? Constantly ask that question. What we hear from federal agencies is try doing some subcontracting work with a federal contractor. Try JVing with a federal contractor if you can. Try to find a way to do some federal contracting work if you want to get a job, because past performance really matters, and not having any direct federal past performance when you're asking for that job is going to really put you down a peg. So making sure you have that is critical.
And the good news is there's several outlets and ways to get that past performance with partnering with larger companies, and so the government's aware of that, and so they have set-asides, and they do try to factor that in.
And you can give, if you have relevant work experience that's similar in the private side, that is acceptable. But again, they're biased on whether or not you've worked with or had to deal with federal processes in the past.
And one point to the federal funding, one thing that separates public work from private work is that the government's never going to go bankrupt. The money will come eventually. Now, when that happens, it's up in the air sometimes, but there's guaranteed funding at some point, and you are comped to a degree of the delays.
So one other thing, when you're looking to get in the federal market, there's something called these North American industry codes. So this is how you determine where you want to work. These are the contracting numbers. There are thousands of NAICS codes. So you have to figure out which NAICS codes fit your business and then look for contracts based on the NAICS codes. That's really a short and simple way of saying know your work, and then try to search contracts through FedBizOps, which Jordan will talk about, using those NAICS codes.
And that's through the North American, so basically Canada, Mexico, the U.S.
No, they all, yes, they use similar codes for those as well, but this is really for our federal government.
Yes. So how do you get a NAICS code? It's self-assigned. You basically go through the codes and see which one matches your business. Basically, it's a calling card. You can have more than one too. So if you're in multiple industries, maybe some construction here and then something else like sewage or dredging, it'll have different codes that you could use. So as long as you have a business and you have an activity, you're going to have a primary and a secondary business NAICS code, and it just describes your revenue processing. So you're going to get that first. That's one of the first steps. And then you should ask yourself if you're a small business. The good news is if you're a small business, the federal government makes it easier for you to get in. And how do you know if you're a small business? If you're a general contractor and you make less than $36.5 million on average from the previous 3 years, you're considered a small business. If you make more than 36.5 and you're a general contractor, you're considered a large business. And I think for subcontractors, it's in the $15 million range, and if you're specialty,
it's about 15 million.
It's about 15 as well.
So the thing that you got to keep in mind is if you're a small business, the benefit about being a small business is that they have set-aside contracts that are just for small businesses to bid on. And within that, being a small business, are you a woman-owned small business? Are you a veteran-owned small business? Are you a hub zone small business? Hub zone deals with people where you employ about 35% of your workforce in economically distressed areas. So, if you fall into these categories, there are specific goals. Don't call them quotas, they're goals that the federal agencies are going after to try to meet. and they're looking for those contractors. And it's not just for prime contracts, but also for subcontracts. There's subcontracting goals for small businesses. So large businesses have to and need small businesses in order to do these contracts. So there's a really, it's a great incentive if you're a small business to get involved in the federal market. The issue comes is if you grow beyond that, where do you go? Because then you're not only competing with the folks that are under 36.5 million or under 15 million, but you're also competing with the multi-billion-dollar companies, and that's where it gets a little dicey. But that's why we have a lot of folks that we talk to. They're comfortable being in the small business market, and they're not really leaving that market. And those that do leave the market have a clear and defined business path. They've established their JV partners, and they've found a way to really go beyond that small business cliff to make it to the next level.
Yeah, that's an important consideration. Before you move from small business to non-small business, you want to make sure that you have the resources and experience. You don't want to just go ahead and take a large contracting project and suddenly be in the non-small business realm and find yourself unable to compete. So that's just something that you need to keep in mind. Okay, great. So Small Business Administration has recently expanded their Mentor Protege program. What is a Mentor Protege program? It's where a large business will go ahead and take a small business on, and they'll form a joint venture for a project. Typically the lifespan is 3 years for these joint venture entities. It can be extended an additional 3 years. So the small business is the protege, the large business is the mentor. There are limits. Mentor can only have 3 proteges at a time. A protege can only have 2 mentors at a time. And the whole goal of this program is to, I guess what each side gets out of it is the small business gets that experience. They get access to projects that they wouldn't have had. When some of these large projects, it's more complicated, complex. You need different sorts of skill sets and equipment. By partnering with a large business, they get access to that and some experience. And you might ask why a large business would want a small business tagging around. Well, if they're able to do this joint venture mentor protege program, they can have access to the 23% of the contracts that are set aside for small businesses alone. And so they get something out of it as well. So it's a big change. The SBA recently expanded this program for many years. It was only allowed for historically disadvantaged businesses. Some of the lists that we had, women-owned small businesses and the like, and the program has proved so successful that the SBA and Congress through legislation has expanded this to all small businesses. So it's a great opportunity to enter the market if you're a small business looking to get some experience. I highly recommend this program. The SBA, if you just go to their website, they have training videos. They have a lot of resources to help you to get this going. How do you find a large business? This is something that they won't help you with. You have to sort of go knocking on doors and just see which large business would help your company the most. So this is a very good program.
And we at AGC have events throughout the country where we try to network with small businesses and large businesses. And just as an example with the Mentor Protege program, though, when you got to think about is the fact that some of the rules are very specific. They want to make sure that it still benefits the small business, because the point of the small business program is to benefit small, not large businesses. So 40% of the work has to be performed by the small business in the mentor protege arrangement. So you also have the mentor protege relationship, 51% has to be the small business in the JV. So you have to keep those things in mind, because the SBA will come after you, and it won't be pretty if you violate any of their rules.
And the SBA is very aware of this, so they're constantly evaluating and monitoring the progress. There's a few forms that have to be checked out every couple of months. In order to do this, again, you go to the SBA's website. There's a 10-minute training session you have to take, and then they have forms to fill out. I would recommend that when you do fill out those forms, you try to mirror them exactly like what's on the website. You'll get a faster response time. and more likely that it'll be approved. You know, the people who work there are humans, and you know, human nature dictates if you see something that's similar, you're going to be more likely to approve it.
And they're approving these an average of 9 days, these agreements.
Yeah,
so that's pretty good for government approval.
Absolutely.
So you're preparing to enter the federal market. We've talked about the cost of the different special requirements. You have to take into account the added risk of compliance costs. You have to think carefully about quality and of this work you're putting out. Think about the warranties, because remember, in the federal market, there is no statute of repose. They can come after you. I really think about warranties in the sense of...
What is that statute of repose? Is that...
So statute of limitations, essentially. There is no federal statute of repose or limitations. You have to keep that in mind. And to me, the dangerous thing is all of these different green and sustainability requirements that are coming out. Is you got to be aware of that risk of saying, well, I have built you this and said that if you use this facility that's LEED Platinum, it's going to maintain that LEED Platinum status. But after 20 years where I've been gone, all of a sudden you haven't used it in those 20 years according to the specs that I put out there. Are you going to come after me, federal government? And that's one of the things that folks in the federal market keep into account, is the risk of litigation after that.
Something that AGC as well is
constantly
pushing for reform of that.
And you got to think about, how do you factor this into your bidding costs? How do you factor into the costs of, well, when am I going to get an issue where I have a change order on a job, and they haven't gotten back to me in 4 months, and I'm still doing the work. How am I going to get paid? Take into account the fact that when you do work for the federal government, in a lot of cases, you might not get paid. You'll get paid eventually. It's a question of when you get paid. Sometimes when you do the change order work, it takes you a little bit longer. So you're, in effect, floating the federal government some money. So you have to take it into that cash flow into account when you're putting out your bid.
All right, so how to enter the federal market. So one great thing is that just virtually all these things are online. If you want to become a contractor for the federal government, you want to give them your resume. So how do you give them your resume? You go to go to SAM. So it stands for System for Award Management. So it's an official government website. This is something that all government contract or employees can view when they make their determinations. It's directory of all businesses, and for the federal government, there's no cost, which is great, and you want to really sell yourself on the SAM, and it's sort of your first introduction, especially if you're a new business. They're going to look at your SAM profile first. So this is what when you go to create an account, this is just sort of a preview of what it looks like. You create an individual account, and it's relatively easy and quick. So after you have your profile and you want to look for some bids, you want to go to this website called fedbizops.gov. This is a really great website. It's run by the federal government. It lists all procurement opportunities, all contracts over $25,000, and it's posted every day. If you go to this website, there's dozens and dozens of new projects every day. So it's something to it's a one-stop shop to every agency, from the Army Corps, the Navy, GSA. It's going to encompass everything, and it has a great filtering system. If you want to just search for places within your area, or say you prefer to work for one agency or the other, you can filter it through that. If you want to, depending on the cost, and $25,000 is virtually every federal project. I've not come across any project that's below that. So here's an example from the Air Force. I just picked one, and it's preventative maintenance and repair on electronic door locks. You can see how the information is laid out pretty clearly. It gives you a description of what they want. It gives you a date when to respond by. You actually have a contact name as well. And what you would do is you'd follow those directions, and you'd submit your bid. When if they approve your bid, they're going to contact you. And unfortunately, many of the agencies are different. They have different requirements as far as how to proceed once you've been awarded a project. You just have to go and make sure you follow the agency-specific rules and system. And also, if you don't win, they'll have a list, and you can see where you are ranked as far as the bidders. So maybe you came in second place, and you know that for your next opportunity. Fed BizOps, this is just an example. It's separated for vendors, buyers, typically government or contractors, and the agencies. So it's a really great website. I recommend just viewing it. You'd be really interested in seeing what the tax dollars are spent on in projects.
Many people right now are going out there to check out the solicitation for building the southern border wall, for example, which is listed on Fed BizOps. So I mean, everything that the federal government is looking to do is out there. So it's all luckily on one website.
Yeah. I just wanted to bring this to your attention. The website asks for a DUNS number. It's completely optional, but I recommend you having a DUNS number. And so what is a DUNS number? So it's a 9-digit identification number for each location of your business. You can kind of think of this as a Social Security or driver's license. It's specific to your industry. It's widely used throughout the world. If you want to work in the government or with the federal government, this is something that you have to have. It's highly encouraged. So you register this with the federal government. All you have to have is your basic information, legal name, headquarters and address of your business. If you're doing business by any other name, address, mailing, telephone, contact name, and this is all this information you'd give anyway. But by putting it on this website, it's able to speed up the process. I thought this was a pretty neat map as well. It shows you where most of the companies that are registered with DUNS numbers are. There's not a lot of surprises there. Some of the big states, California, Texas. You see Virginia. Virginia has a lot of federal work as well with a lot of the bases and the federal agencies as well.
So performing work for a federal agency, I kind of touched on that before. All federal agencies are not necessarily the same, and then even within a federal agency, you can work for the Seattle office or the LA office, and it could be not completely different, but have a little bit different tinge. I kind of want to say it's like going to McDonald's in New England. They put ketchup and mustard on their burgers, whereas if you go in New York, it's just ketchup on the burger. So there's a little bit different based upon where you are in the country as to what the different offices want. So you have to really know before you go. I highly recommend a lot of these agencies and their local offices have industry days. They post those on Fed BizOps as well.
What is an industry day?
An industry day is basically where their contracting officers or their engineers or their chiefs of construction come out and will actually interact, and they'll also tell you, hey, these are the things we're looking to put out in the street over the next year, over the next 2 years. You could find that information generally on Fed BizOps.
It's great just to meet the people and the personalities of the agency. If they've met you before, they're likely to respond to your inquiries even quicker. So
and again, we said that the incentive for the federal agencies aren't necessarily the same as the private owners. Money doesn't necessarily have the same impact on federal agencies as they do a private owner, where time is money. So you've got to really pick your agencies and pick the people that you work with well. That's a key part of doing business, whether, again, you're working for a private owner or a public owner, but it really makes a difference knowing who you're going to work with, knowing the offices that you're going to work with beforehand to the best of your knowledge. That's where you go to the industry days, you go to your local associations, whether it's AGC or another, and you talk to the contractors there to see what do they think of folks. I've learned a lot just from talking to the contractors about certain district offices of the Army Corps, for example. That helps a lot.
And the agency that puts out the bid and asks for work isn't necessarily the owner, is it?
That's absolutely correct. You could have a job where the Army Corps is the construction manager, but the end client is Customs and Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security, or the Air Force. So, you're not only dealing with the Army Corps, but then an additional layer of government instruction. How do those agencies work well? Because, you could have a situation where they're not talking well to each other. So you really want to know not just who's the agency you're working for, but who's the end client. So pitfalls to avoid: be prepared to invest time and money. That goes with any job, but when it comes to the federal government, you really need to think about one thing, and that's communication. You need to make sure that expectations are known at the outset of the job, how much money they expect you to put in, how much time they expect you to talk, when you think that you're going to have, are you going to have monthly meetings, are you going to have weekly meetings, quarterly meetings, to make sure your progress is meeting the jobs. You need to make sure that your bids are in line with their expectations beforehand, if possible. But really, you do the pre-construction meetings before you get to turning dirt, and that's really the key. But you can't just say, here's our pre-construction meeting and it's going to be great and we're just not going to talk to each other. We'll just go to our separate trailers and call it good. You really got to go in and say, we're going to meet today for a couple hours. We're going to talk about the pre-construction. Here are the questions that I had from RFIs, requests for information, that you haven't answered, and that we need to answer before we break ground, so that we can adjust the schedule accordingly. You've got to be aware of, there's going to be change orders. How are you going to address those change orders? In what fashion? Where do we have to go? What's the path?
And a change order is just any change to the contract. There's not one contract out there that, after everything's been signed, that you start digging up the dirt and suddenly you find that there's a bunch of wires there, or it's a bunch of rock, or something that people didn't expect, or it might be a change just for preference. I don't want blue paint. I want green paint. So there's going to be a change.
Differing site conditions or whatever, things that you see in the private side, but you also have to deal with on the federal. But you just have to be prepared to know, well, who do I go to get this paid? And once some person says, well, I need to go above, who's that next person above? So what you want to do at that pre-construction meeting is not just identify who are the people to get a decision from that are on the site. You want to know, well, when we have a disagreement, what's the next step in the ladder I have to go to make sure we can get some sort of agreement? And if there's no agreement there, where's the next step? So you have to have these decision ladders where, if you're going to do this right, you need to make sure I can get a decision made in a certain amount of time, and not, the worst decision you can ever get is a no decision on a project. And you've got to make sure that you can get to the decision maker, because depending upon the thresholds of the dollar amount you're looking for, that guy on the job site's not going to be able to give you an answer. So you got to take that into account. You got to make sure you know that information and where he has to go, so that if he's not doing his job, you can call up above him. Happens all the time. It's not really great to call someone's boss asking for things, but you're running a business. They're not. This is how you stay in business.
And that's one of the things we do as an association, is that we try to help foster that communication. If a contractor is deadlocked, we try to do what we can to speed up that process as well. Startup company. Yeah, just like we said before, you do not want to be a startup company. It's expensive to getting into the federal market. It's something that you need to have experience in, and basically cash reserves. But there's always a learning curve within any new market, and especially the federal market.
And that's why something like the Small Business Mentor Protege program is not a bad way to start out if you can, and subcontracting on work or JVing on some small jobs. Not a bad place to start. So when you're working for the federal government, what happens in DC matters quite a bit. There's obviously been a lot of talk about deregulation. That's whether you're in the private sector or public sector. There's a lot of bills moving through Congress. As we know, Congress can be slow in passing legislation. And not necessarily as prolific as the regulatory agencies. As an example, in 2016, there were over 3,800 new regulations issued. That's more than 18 times the number of laws that federal agencies put into place last year. than the number of laws that Congress passed last year. So what happens in these federal agencies matters a whole lot. And there are agencies like the EPA, OSHA, and the Army Corps that put out a lot of things that impact your business, whether you're a private construction company or a federal construction company. So you really need to keep an eye on it, because when you sign your name to that dotted line, you're saying that I'm going to comply with all of these laws and all of these regulations that they're putting out. So we are actually advocating for more deregulation, looking for ways to get Congress more involved in the process of blocking a lot of what we think are overburdensome regulations that are impacting business and not getting the job done. So we're looking at things like the Trump's 2-for-1 executive order for each new rule that you come on the book. The agencies need to identify for elimination 2 regulations. It's something that, in theory is a very good idea to get agencies thinking about taking things that are obsolete, duplicative off the books, so that folks don't have to comply with 2 counter-heading measures. However, how it works in legal practice is going to be a real challenge, and it's been very fun to be in DC and talking to some of these federal agencies and kind of how perplexed they are, how they're going to deal with it.
And it's almost as difficult to repeal a regulation it is to implement it. It has to, just to repeal an old regulation, it has to go through notice, rulemaking, comment. It takes just about as long. So it's not something that's a quick fix. So any regulation out there, comply with it, even if you think it's going away, even if it's been named as something that is on in the crosshairs of deregulation.
Yeah, we can't. You guys are business owners. You need to comply with the law today, not what's said in campaign promises. And there are a lot of things that President Obama thought he could do through executive order that the court said that could not be done. And similarly, President Trump is finding that same problem as well. The federal government does not work by voice command. There is this thing called the Constitution. There's a lot of checks and balances. It's a little more complex than running a construction company or a lot of things, and he's finding the same problems his predecessor had in trying to streamline certain things or put in new initiatives when it comes to the courts. And the big issue that we were facing was what we called the blacklisting regulation, where contractors were going to have to report not just labor law violations, but allegations of labor law violations before they bid on every federal contract. This wasn't something we thought was fair. Just as you have due process rights if you're charged with a crime and not convicted, you have due process rights, we believe, as a company, if you're charged with a crime but don't have, you're allowed to defend yourself. This rule would have not allowed you to defend yourself, and in effect, the contracting officers could de facto debar you. And as we've learned with the federal government, if you have a very vague standard and you have 2 contracting officers sitting next to each other in the same room looking at the same piece of information, they can come to 2 different conclusions as to who they think is a responsible contractor and who they think is not. That's not necessarily a system that we think was necessary. There already was a suspension of debarment process that was being used actually 4 times more over the last 5 years than previously to debar contractors that were bad actors. So what we didn't like was the fact that this sort of regulation would wrap in not just the bad actors, but the innocent contractors with the bad actors. And then obviously we're looking to improve the procurement process with the federal agencies. We're trying to make sure, if you're a subcontractor, if you're a prime contractor, among your number 1 issues is getting paid. And it's not just getting paid, it's getting paid on time, getting paid quickly. So there's a Prompt Payment Act that protects the subcontractors' payments from the prime contractor, but if the government agency doesn't pay the prime contractor, well, you, Mr. Subcontractor, aren't going to get paid for that from that prime contractor. There is no Prompt Payment Act for the federal government to pay their contractors. So we are looking at ways where we can have the federal government actually pay their contractors on time for the work that they've completed, just as prime contractors are required to do so for their subcontractors. It's a real problem when you're working in a cash flow business, and there's no bigger business that involves cash flow than the construction business. So that's the sort of issues that we're working on in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, but it's an exciting time. We haven't heard this much momentum for deregulation in the last 30 years. So it's something to be optimistic about, and there's going to be plenty more news coming out of Washington.
So we've actually been in D.C. and over the last several months given our agendas to the Trump transition team and to the folks that are in the agencies, and starting to staff up the agencies and agendas for different ways where you can fund the infrastructure plan, different ways that, if you're all in the construction industry, it's no surprise that we're facing a worker shortage right now. That's the number one issue we hear from about 70% of our over 26,000 commercial construction company members. So one of the best ways to help resolve our workforce issue is having a lot of work for them to do, finding ways also to prepare, train, Pell Grants, vocational training, and just getting the message out that not everyone needs to go to a 4-year liberal arts school and be a history or poli-sci major like me. You should probably also consider being a plumber, being a tradesman. One of the best things I learned from our own conference that we had recently, there were a lot of financial advisors walking around that are talking about investments, and I said, you're at a construction event. What are you talking about investments, and why are you here? And he said, my best clients are plumbers, they're electricians, they're not the doctors and the lawyers. The plumbers and the electricians and the tradesmen, they're making way more than the doctors and lawyers. So I'm here to handle their funds and to look for business. And I just found that interesting, and it's because there's just such a strain for those skilled workers right now that they're able to really do very well. So we're looking for ways where we can go into the high schools, go into the colleges, expand vocational training, and just get the message out that you don't have to be a doctor or a lawyer to really succeed. You can also get your hands a little dirty and do even better than those guys and girl and ladies. So, and we've also gone out to the agencies and pass out our plan, the Make Federal Agencies Responsible Again. One of the biggest issues we faced over the last 8 years was as construction companies that are working for the federal government and regulated by the federal government, there are a lot of things that the folks in DC don't know about the construction business. And they weren't, quite frankly, interested in what it was like to be a construction contractor and work on a job, and weren't often interested in talking to them, but we're more than happy to regulate them. So now we're talking more about, okay, we're no longer your opponents, we're your partners. And we're seeing a lot of folks changing and saying, we want to actually talk to you before we regulate, we want to talk to you during the regulatory process. We want to find ways where we could still carry out the law as it was written, but do so in a manner that makes sense when you guys are out in the job site. So that's among many of the things, and obviously we had a very long list of over 50 pages of different regulations that we found could either be repealed, tweaked, or in some cases actually kept, that we thought provided a certain amount of certainty to the construction market, that to go back and do anything to them could actually disrupt the market more so than not. So those are some of the plans that we put out there right now.
And these, both of these documents are available on our website at agc.org. I highly recommend just reading it, or it's eye-opening to see some of the regulations and their impact, and it's very interesting, and it's laid out relatively easy, where it has the regulation, the impact, and what AGC thinks this does to the construction industry. And I think there'd be some surprises in there if you want to take a look. And then every year AGC has an annual conference, the Federal Contractors Conference. That's in Washington, D.C. It's where contractors can meet with agencies, the headquarters of agencies in most cases, and there's a list on the side, and it's a great opportunity to meet other federal contractors, meet the agencies, get a forecast of what each agency thinks is going to be coming down the pipeline, and it's a great opportunity just to hear some of the benefits and burdens that federal contractors have, and also how these agencies are addressing them. I highly recommend.
I would say one of the best lines I had about that conference was from a small businessman who said, well, when I go to an AGC event in San Diego, for example, he said, I get to meet with the guys from Mr. Smith's construction company, but when I actually go to this event, I get to meet Mr. Smith of Mr. Smith's construction company. So you really get to meet the actual owners of these large construction companies, as well as the small ones, and there's a lot of access to folks to ask questions. The federal agencies are there, and they're showing you their portfolio of work for the next several years, and telling you what they're planning on putting on the street. So it's a really...
Some of the policy changes as well that they see coming down and how they're going to address issues.
Yep, policy changes, projects that are coming out. So it's a good way to get a jump on your competition.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.